How did you find him? I mean, under a parking lot. How did you figure out to dig there?
I think it was a really strong sensation for me in that car park, and I had to follow it. Bonkers though it sounds, I had to do it.
For centuries, one of England's most controversial kings lay hidden in a place no king should ever rest. Beneath faded asphalt, between white-painted parking lines, under the rumble of car tires and the indifference of modern life. But when scientists finally lifted him out of the dirt, they expected to solve a mystery. Instead, they unlocked something so unsettling that it shook the foundations of royal history and forced researchers to quietly revise what they found. Now in 2025, the full truth is finally coming out, and it is far darker than anyone imagined. The journey began not with a historian, but with a screenwriter named Philippa Langley, a woman who trusted intuition as fiercely as logic. While studying old maps of Greyfriars Church, the medieval burial site believed to hold Richard III, she noticed something strange. Every map, no matter the century, aligned perfectly with one modern location, a drab city council parking lot. It made no sense. Scholars dismissed the idea unanimously. A king under asphalt? Impossible. But Langley kept returning to the same cold patch of pavement, convinced the ground itself was trying to tell her something. Eventually, and against every reasonable prediction, the University of Leicester agreed to dig a single trench. No promises, no expectations, just enough earth removed to prove the theory wrong, so everyone could move on. But fate had other plans. On the very first morning of the excavation in August of 2012, an archaeologist brushing through a layer of compacted clay uncovered 2 human leg bones. Not animal remains, not scattered fragments, actual legs, still aligned in anatomical position. The team widened the trench and a partial skeleton emerged, then a full one. The grave had been cut in haste, too short for the body laid inside, forcing the skull upward at a sharp angle. This alone hinted at a burial carried out without honor, likely by enemies, not mourners. The bones themselves told a violent story. The man was in his early 30s. Richard died at 32. 10 injuries marked the skeleton, 8 to the skull. One powerful sword strike had sliced into the base of the head. Another wound, delivered by a halberd, pierced straight through the skull's crown. These were not battlefield glancing blows. These were execution-level injuries dealt after the victim had been surrounded and unhorsed. And then there was the spine. A severe curve twisted the vertebrae to one side. Adolescent onset scoliosis. Not the monstrous deformity painted by Tudor propaganda, but a real condition that would have raised one shoulder higher than the other. For the first time, history and anatomy spoke the same language. Still, physical evidence wasn't enough. To declare a king found, scientists needed proof no enemy, legend, or rumor could erase. They needed the truth locked inside the bones themselves. And when they opened that door, they discovered not one truth, but 2. One confirmed Richard's identity. The other threatened to unravel the very bloodline he died defending. The skeleton beneath the parking lot had revealed enough clues to make archaeologists nearly certain they had found Richard III. But nearly isn't enough when you are identifying a king. Physical traits can be debated. Wounds can be interpreted. Even burial locations can mislead. What cannot be argued, however, is DNA. And that was precisely where the story began to fracture into something far more dramatic than anyone expected. The scientists from the University of Leicester knew obtaining genetic material from 500-year-old bones would be incredibly difficult. Ancient DNA breaks down into tiny fragments, contaminates easily, and behaves more like shattered glass than a readable blueprint. To reduce the risk of modern interference, the team worked in a sealed, clean room wearing full protective gear, drilling into the femur and a molar, the 2 densest places where genetic material might still be hiding. But even if they could extract it, they needed something extraordinarily rare: living descendants who carried the same maternal lineage as Richard III. That meant tracing the family tree through the one branch that never gets mixed. The line carried from mother to child through mitochondrial DNA. This type of DNA, passed only by mothers, is like a signature that barely changes across centuries. And Richard had one surviving path through his sister, Anne of York. Tracing her line forward across 17 generations was a task that no computer could solve alone. Genealogists combed through baptism records, parish books, marriage certificates, handwritten family charts, and faded documents stored in private collections. After years of reconstructing names and connections, they finally reached two living individuals who shared Anne's maternal line: Michael Ibsen, a cabinet maker living in London, and his distant cousin, Wendy Doldig. Both agreed to provide DNA samples. And when the ancient mitochondrial fragments from the parking lot skeleton were reconstructed, cleaned of contamination, and compared, the match was unmistakable. The haplogroup they shared was rare in Europe, making the odds of coincidence nearly non-existent. This was the moment the world had waited for, a genetic confirmation, solid and undeniable. The remains were Richard III. The announcement in early 2013 was met with global celebration. A lost king had been found. Shakespeare's villain had been humanized. History had been rewritten. But behind the scenes, the scientists were already preparing for a second test, one far more delicate, far more revealing, and far more dangerous to the story they had just confirmed. The next step was to analyze the Y chromosome, the marker passed directly from father to son. Unlike mitochondrial DNA, this marker carries the uninterrupted paternal lineage, the very thread medieval kings used to justify their divine right to rule. If Richard was who the bones claimed he was, his Y chromosome should match that of modern descendants of the Plantagenet male line, men whose ancestry traced back through Henry Somerset, the 5th Duke of Beaufort, to King Edward III. The team expected a confirmation. What they got instead was a shock so complete that it threatened to undo everything they had just proved. Because when the results came back, the paternal DNA didn't simply fail to match. It was a total, absolute, impossible break. And it wasn't just a mystery. It was the first sign that England's royal bloodline might not be what history claimed it to be. The excitement surrounding the mitochondrial DNA match should have ended the investigation. By every traditional measure, Richard III had been identified. The injuries aligned with historical accounts, the spinal curvature matched descriptions, and the maternal DNA sealed the case. But when the data emerged, the room went quiet. Richard's Y chromosome didn't just differ slightly from that of the documented Beaufort descendants. It was nowhere near them. Not close, not related, not compatible with any known branch of the accepted Plantagenet paternal line. It was an absolute break, a genetic canyon where a bridge should have been. This wasn't the kind of discrepancy that could be explained by laboratory error or contamination. Ancient DNA might degrade, but it doesn't reinvent itself. A modern Somerset descendant might inherit small mutations, but they don't transform into an entirely different haplogroup. There was only one explanation. Somewhere along the centuries, a child had been fathered by a man who was not the one recorded in royal genealogy. In scientific terms, this is called a false paternity event. In royal terms, it is catastrophic. The revelation landed like a tremor across the academic world. If the break had occurred after Richard III, sometime in the long Somerset descent, then the issue was embarrassing but containable. A modern aristocratic family might have a misplaced ancestor, but history remained intact. Yet the alternative possibility was something far more explosive. The break might have happened before Richard III. If so, then Richard, his brother Edward IV, perhaps even their father, might not have been legitimate heirs to the throne at all. The implications were enormous. The Yorkist claim during the Wars of the Roses centered entirely on pure paternal descent. Medieval kingships lived or died on the certainty of a father's blood. A fracture in that chain meant the Yorkist dynasty, the one that fought, ruled, and spilled blood for the crown, may have stood on a false foundation. The problem was that in 2014, science wasn't able to say where the break occurred. The tools weren't advanced enough. sequencing technology couldn't read long enough strands. The comparison samples were limited, and the political sensitivity of the results was undeniable. So the research team did something very deliberate. They published their findings with careful language. They presented both possibilities evenly. Perhaps the break came later, perhaps earlier. They did not accuse, they did not conclude. They did not ignite the full scandal simmering beneath the data. The world celebrated a found king, while the deeper truth, the destabilizing one, sat quietly between the lines of the report. And for nearly a decade, that unanswered question waited in silence. Until 2025, when a new team finally had the technology to hunt the breakdown to a single man. For 10 years, the unanswered question lingered like a specter. Where exactly had the royal bloodline fractured? The 2014 team had been honest about the limits of their tools, but the vagueness left a hole big enough for uncertainty and speculation to flourish. It would take a new generation of technology and a team unburdened by the politics of the original discovery to finally confront the mystery directly. In 2025, that moment arrived. The Royal Bloodline Genomic Reanalysis Project brought together researchers from the University of Leicester, Harvard, and the Max Planck Institute, forming a coalition of scientists armed with methods that would have seemed impossible a decade earlier. Where the 2014 team worked with broken fragments, the new team used long-read sequencing, technology capable of capturing immense, continuous stretches of ancient DNA untouched by the technological limitations of the past. This time, they weren't just confirming identity. They were mapping the genetic landscape of an entire dynasty. The project's first challenge was simple on paper but monumental in practice. Determine which Y chromosome, Richard's or the Somersets, represented the true Plantagenet line. The original study couldn't answer that, but the new team realized the solution required a third data point, an uncontaminated male line relative who lived before any potential break could have occurred. One name stood out: John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, son of King Edward III. His tomb in Westminster Abbey had never been disturbed. His paternal lineage was beyond dispute. And so, after lengthy negotiations, the Abbey granted permission for a microscopic extraction, a sliver of material no larger than a grain of dust, taken from deep within the ancient stone container. When that sample finally arrived in the laboratory, it was treated with the utmost caution. The team built a genetic profile from the ground up, piece by ancient piece, cross-checking every fragment for authenticity. Meanwhile, a separate group dug deep into the living Somerset lineage, tracing their Y chromosome back through time to identify any potential breaks. Weeks later, the data converged. The Somerset Y chromosome aligned almost perfectly with the Y chromosome of John of Gaunt, an unbroken paternal chain stretching from medieval England to the present day. The patterns, markers, and haplogroup signatures were unmistakable. Then came the second comparison. Richard III's Y chromosome showed no relation at all. It wasn't a distant branch, a mutated cousin, or a degraded variant. It was a completely different paternal line, incompatible in every meaningful way with the confirmed Plantagenet signature. There was no longer any room for interpretation. The Beaufort-Somerset line was the true male line descendant of Edward III. Richard III's line was not. And if Richard did not inherit the true Plantagenet Y chromosome, that meant the break, the false paternity event, hadn't occurred generations after him. It had occurred before him, within his own immediate family. The curtain had finally been pulled back. The question was no longer whether the royal line fractured, but who fractured it. When the 2025 team isolated the break in the lineage, all roads led to a single man, Richard, Duke of York. And with that conclusion, a rumor whispered for half a millennium suddenly roared back to life. During the Wars of the Roses, enemies of the House of York had spread a story so damaging, so vicious, that even medieval chroniclers hesitated to repeat it. They claimed the Duchess of York, Cecily Neville, had conceived one of her sons while her husband, the Earl of Cambridge, was away at war. The alleged father, the rumor said, was an English archer. a handsome commoner known in some accounts as Blayborn. The claim was dismissed at the time as political slander, the sort of mud thrown in the heat of civil conflict. But the genetics from 2025 told a different story. Not an accusation, not a myth, a biological fact. The true Plantagenet Y chromosome, the one carried by John of Gaunt and preserved in the Somerset line, stopped before it reached Richard, Duke of York. Every man who came after him, including King Edward IV and King Richard III, carried a different paternal signature. The dynasty that justified its right to rule through an unbroken line of fathers and sons had fractured at its core. This meant something almost impossible to overstate. Richard, Duke of York, the very man who triggered the Wars of the Roses by asserting his superior bloodline, had no legitimate paternal claim to the throne at all, and neither did his sons. The revelation reframed the entire conflict. For 3 decades, England had bled itself dry in a battle over which branch of Edward III's descendants held the purer lineage. Families were wiped out, castles changed hands, tens of thousands perished on fields like Towton, where snow turned red under the weight of an unimaginable slaughter. But the Yorkist argument, the entire foundation of their claim, was built on a lineage that did not genetically exist. And this wasn't just a matter of politics. It cut to the heart of medieval identity. Blood was everything. Legitimacy wasn't symbolic. It was law, religion, and destiny woven together. By those standards, the House of York had risen on a false premise, fought on a false premise, and ruled on a false premise. The discovery triggered a cascade of new questions. How much did Cecily Neville know? Was the false paternity a secret shame or a calculated maneuver to secure her family's future? Historians revisited her surviving letters, her movements during her husband's absences, and the careful timing of her children's births. A different portrait began to emerge, not of scandal, but of strategy. A woman navigating a brutal world, protecting her position in a society where a single misstep could cost everything. Even more haunting was the impact on her children. If Edward IV's bloodline wasn't legitimate, what did that mean for his sons, the princes in the Tower? And for Richard III's desperate grab for the crown? The 2025 findings didn't answer those questions. They raised them, loudly, painfully, and with no way to retreat back into comforting myths, because now the truth was undeniable. The break was real, and it had rewritten everything the Yorks believed about themselves. The shockwaves from the findings didn't stop at Richard, Duke of York. Once the break was confirmed in his generation, historians and geneticists were forced to confront a brutal truth. The entire Yorkist dynasty, every victory, every coronation, every declaration of divine right, rested on a story that biology had quietly contradicted for 5 centuries. And yet the most haunting part wasn't the scandal itself. It was the questions that rose from its ashes. If Richard III had inherited a fractured lineage, what did he know? How much had been whispered behind locked doors? Did he grow up believing in the power of his father's blood, only to discover it was an illusion? Or did the truth strike him later, when the crown was no longer a possibility, but a prize clawed from the chaos of civil war? The new genetic evidence cast his entire life in a darker, more fragile light. When he declared his nephews, the princes in the Tower, illegitimate, was it political maneuvering or a frantic attempt to smother a truth that threatened his family from within? The records show a man increasingly isolated, increasingly paranoid, increasingly convinced that the bloodline had to be protected at any cost. But now, with 2025 technology revealing what medieval eyes could never see, those decisions take on an eerie new meaning. If he believed his family's claim was built on a lie, how far would he go to control the narrative? The disappearance of the princes has always been one of history's darkest enigma, but this new genetic context adds a chilling possibility. Perhaps Richard's actions were not driven solely by ambition, but by fear. Fear that the next generation would expose the dynasty's buried secret, fear that the illusion of legitimacy would crumble, fear that the throne he fought for had never truly belonged to the Yorks at all. And beyond Richard III lies the final question. the one no monarchy wants asked out loud. If the Yorkist bloodline fractured in the 15th century, what does that say about everyone who followed? The current royal family descends from Tudor and later Stuart lines, but those lines intertwined repeatedly with Yorkist and Lancaster branches. And while modern monarchy no longer rests on claims of divine lineage, the idea of inherited legitimacy is still woven into the institution's identity. The 2025 discovery doesn't erase history, but it forces the world to look at it with new eyes. Because now we know that a single moment, a single choice made in a medieval household reshaped the fate of a nation. And the truth sat hidden in Richard III's bones, locked away until science was finally sophisticated enough to uncover it. What other secrets still lie buried in the DNA of kings? If you want more deep dive documentaries like this, exploring hidden truths, ancient mysteries, and the secrets history tried to bury, make sure you subscribe to The Forgotten Depths so you never miss what comes next.